Welcome, everybody. We're now moving into the first of our parallel sessions of the Parliament. So what we're going to do in this session is look at a series of case studies that will be presented to us by our partners, and we'll be spotlighting some key challenges that organisations have faced in the environmental justice space, and we'll be trying to showcase some examples of what successful action in that space looks like. So we're going to do that by means of a series of 15-minute presentations by panelists from different partner organisations. And that will then be followed by breakout discussion sessions in which we want to provide an inclusive space for delegates to ask questions, share learnings, and reflect on their own work and practice. So I'll introduce each of our speakers just before they take to the stage and begin their 15-minute slot. So first off, we have a panel from the Poetry Society and the Young Poets Network. So I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Natasha Ryan, who is a writer and an arts administrator from Cornwall and who lives in London. And she's the education manager at the Poetry Society. Welcome, Natasha. Sia Mangat is a writer from London who works as an education coordinator at the Poetry Society as well. Welcome, Sia. And Anisha Jaya Minocha is a Manchester-based writer who's studying at St Andrews, and she co-edits Sync magazine for Northern Writers and has been published by Renard Press, Propel, and The Resurgence and Ecologist magazine. So over to the three of you, and I will give you a 2-minute warning when necessary. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Catriona. Good morning, everyone. So yeah, like Catriona said, my name is Natasha, and I'm joined by Sia and Anisha today. We're from the Poetry Society. Just to give you a very quick overview of who we are. So we're the leading organisation for poetry in the UK. We are a membership organisation. So we have about 4,500 members all across the UK and internationally. We publish the Poetry Review and run the National Poetry Competition. And then we have a big education programme. We are also an Arts Council England national portfolio organisation. And some of you might be aware that one of the investment principles of the Arts Council is around the environment. So it's very much a kind of central part of our programme. But even long before that, we had quite a history and a commitment to programming environmental work. And a lot of that is done through our education programmes. So some of it has been in partnership with Renew. So for example, we've been working in schools in Plymouth with the South West Peatland Partnership around bogs over the past year or so. We've also been working on ghost ponds with schools in Manchester. We create a lot of learning resources about the environment, which are distributed to schools and arts organisations. And then we do, I would say, the bulk of our environmental work through our platform for young poets, which is called Young Poets Network. And before I hand over to Sia to just tell you a little bit more about that, just wanted to give you a bit of an insight into why we think this work is important. And really, a lot of it is to do with, there was a lot of conversation yesterday around kind of future generations. And so what we want to do by using poetry to explore the environment is give a voice to young people as stakeholders in the future, to give them a say in decisions that are made in the present. We want to explore ways that creativity can be used to give a voice to nature itself. So that's what a lot of Bog Talk was about, encouraging kind of empathy and storytelling through that creative connection. We also want to give people a sense of kind of community and collectivity because we know there's a lot of kind of climate anxiety out there. So we think that kind of creative coming together can really inspire hope and a sort of positive energy in addressing these challenges. And we want to use poetry and those learning resources to raise awareness. So I'm going to hand over to Sia, who's going to tell you about what we do in more detail.
Cool. Thank you, Natasha. So I'm Sia and I run Young Poets Network at the Poetry Society, which is our online platform for young people aged 5 to 25 worldwide. A big part of our programming is running writing challenges, which are basically free online writing competitions that anyone aged 5 to 25 in the world can enter. And we'll usually post lots of writing prompts and example poems to help inspire entries. So in the last 2 years, we've run 4 eco poetry challenges specifically, and we've had 944 poems entered by young poets in 43 countries to those challenges. I think it's worth noting, while we do get lots of poems in from young people across the UK and in English speaking countries like the US and New Zealand, lots of these poems come in from young people in countries that are sort of at the front line of the climate crisis, so particularly in South Asia and in Africa. Lots of the challenges we run are in partnership with other organisations. So we ran one earlier this year was Renew, which was the bog challenge, where we asked young people to write poems about bogs. Here are some more examples. We ran one with Portland Japanese Garden based in the US, all about peace and quiet and sort of mindfulness and finding that in a natural environment. We've run a series with people in nature, and the latest was Sound Worlds and Songscapes, which was all about connecting to nature through music and sound. And we ran the Adorable Animals Challenge with eco-poet Izzy Gallimore, which was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which asked young people to write about how the sort of concept of cuteness affects our sympathy for animals going extinct. We're also really committed to sort of inspiring and empowering young people to use their voices to advocate for the natural world. So on the left here, we brought some YPN challenge winners to COP26 in Glasgow and had them perform as part of the conference, which is really exciting. And we also commissioned them to reflect on their experience and share it in these sort of diary entry features on our website for other young poets to read and reflect on. As part of our broader projects, we'll often ask young poets to write features, again, sharing their own experience and making them feel sort of empowered, like they're part of a wider conversation, which obviously affects them really personally. This is a lovely quote from Daniel Clark, who is a young poet who we took to COP26.
Hi there, Sia. Can I just interrupt you just a second? I think the slides aren't moving on.
Oh.
So we can just still see the Young Poets Network logo.
Okay. Let me try again.
It might be worth unsharing and then resharing the slides as a solution.
Okay, can you see them now?
We can't see them in slideshow, but we can see, yes, now we can see them, yeah.
Okay, you missed out on my lovely pics. So for the collaborative challenges I was talking about, and then this is one of the pictures from COP26 and the feature about it just below. This is the quote I was about to read to you from Daniel Clark, who came with us to COP26. He says, "Poetry can't reverse climate breakdown, but as nature vanishes all around us, young poets are planting seeds for the type of world they want to grow up in." And I think that sort of approach is at the core of our environmental programming in YPN specifically. We're also really big on this being like big conversation between young poets. So we run free writing workshops online, usually on weekend afternoons, so that as many people can join as possible. And they are recorded so that other young poets can access them afterwards, especially if they're in different time zones. So on screen, you can see this is a screenshot from a workshop run by Caleb Parkin a couple of months ago, where he got everyone to look up biodiversity policy documents online and create blackout poems from them. Cool. I'm just going to pass over to Anisha after I read you this other quote from Alia Begum, who was at COP26 too. She says, "Poetry acts as a playground for me to try and imagine a better future. Whether I'm anthropomorphizing birds or tadpoles, poetry allows me to explore what our world would say if it could talk back." Okay, over to you, Anisha.
Thanks, yeah. I think yeah, what I'm going to say leads on really nicely from what Sia and Natasha said, because so I started kind of being involved with the Poetry Society from being a foil poet, but I also set and judged one of the competitions that many competitions that they had in 2021. So I was exploring epistolary poems. So epistolary poems, for those of you who don't know, are basically ways in which we can write letters as poems. And even though this might not be like a very like it might not be something that's so ecological or that seems to do much with the natural world, but I thought that it did tend a lot to explore this idea of dialogue and interconnection with other beings, and I think that is at the center of what kind of being ecological or writing ecologically is. Um, I wrote a poem called Daffodils to You as a to show that, you know, how we can write to talk to nature through our language and through poems. And I think challenges like that, it was great to read all the submissions because a lot of people, a lot of young poets started to write to things that maybe didn't have a voice or that brought life to other things and beings around them. Um, then in 2022, as you can see on the screen here, I went to the Portland Japanese Garden hosted a symposium in the Guildhall, which was called the Peace Symposium London. And this was a series of symposiums that they were holding in various venues around the world. And it included kind of a very interdisciplinary way of looking at gardens as the center point, but also they had talks from people from diplomacy or people who worked in gardens, people, poets as well were invited. And so I thought that this was a great space to have a look at the way that different institutions and different individuals connected with that common theme of gardens and how so it looked at these Japanese gardens as a way of holding peace and a way of preserving it. And I thought it was great, that moment, that conference was great to see how different people can intersect and how all of our disciplines are all leaning towards that one sort of common goal of finding peace in nature. And it was a lovely event to read at. And then sort of fast forwarding 3 years later, as Natasha and Sia both mentioned, the Bog Talk, which was run by the University of Exeter Renew Programme and the Southwest Peatland Partnership. I participated in that challenge, and I thought that challenges like that are, again, like the same sort of thing that I did with my epistolary poems. It gave poets a chance to look at something that wasn't necessarily human and to sort of fine tune the way we think about the world that is not human. And I think that's what poetry does in general, whether some of the poems are like distinctly ecological, like the Bog Challenge, but others aren't. And I think either way, we're learning to give attention to the world around us through the poem. I think there's a common phrase like called the poet's eye, and I think that's a really interesting way of seeing how poems can help bring to life other things and different perspectives. So it's not just necessarily looking at things in a very like lyrical, romanticized idea of what a poem is. But for example, with the bog poem, I was inspired to really get to know what a bog was, why their function was, and I think challenges like that helped all the kind of nitty-gritty things and all the all the looking into different aspects of what something that is not human is and how we can sort of talk to it and perceive it. During like my time with like working with the Poetry Society, I've also been inspired to do quite a lot of my own ecological based poetry practice, and it's led me to so right now, I'm very interested in Indian philosophies and their ideas of recycling, and how poetry itself is a sort of form of recycling. Was inspired mostly by when I was in college, so between the ages of 16 to 18, I helped co-run Young Friends of the Earth, and having the kind of freedom and liberty to sort of just do projects, and even though it was during COVID, to see what young people were sort of capable of as a collective was really helpful for my own poetry practices later on. I've since run like workshops on ecological poems, and I started a writing residency with a great a charity called Green and Away, which is on the screen. And these really helped to show how like ecology can be a form of poetry practice, and they can be quite interchangeable and extremely linked. So during my writing residency, I ran workshops to like international volunteers and different groups of people who came from a broad range of countries on how poetry can be a form of recycling. So things like blackout poetry or found poetry, which is where you sort of take bits from different sources. So it can be like magazines, it can be other poetry books, it can be novels, anything, and that can make its own poem. And I think that's quite symbolic of recycling and of these ecological processes as a whole. So that was really enjoyable, and I've since kind of doing all these poetic kind of endeavors. I've since moved to doing to exploring these interests in different films
2 minute
mediums. So
warning.
thank you. So I'm working with the Javid Alipur company to write and direct a poetry film on this ancient Sanskrit epic, which is about it's essentially translated as the cloud carrier. So in all of this, I'm kind of looking at the different ways in which we can view the natural world and how it can kind of it can deliver messages that maybe humans can't. So yeah, thanks for listening.
Great, thank you, Anisha. I hope that's given you an idea of the kind of flavour of what we've been doing. Obviously, happy to go into more detail in the discussion. And I just wanted to end by sort of saying quickly how delighted we are that that kind of natural work that we've been doing has quite organically led to some nice kind of onward connections. So, for example, after the bog project, we were then approached by some artists in Malaysia, where we've been doing a lot of work to do a kind of a peat-based project with a UK-Malaysia exchange called Peat on Earth. We've also been working with like a green engineering firm in Rotherham around kind of school workshops in a competition about sort of designing a greener future. So what I'm saying essentially is hopefully this is just the beginning and really looking forward to carrying on the conversation. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to the three of you. There's loads to dig into there, and just hearing about how poetry and creative practice can be so sort of directly engaged with the world and with justice challenges, and I think is really fascinating and important. So please, I would encourage everybody to post your questions in the Q&A box. And I will gather those up at the end of this session where we have some time for discussion as a group. So thank you very much for that. We're now going to move on to our second case study presentation, which is from Rory Crawford from the National Trust, who's going to talk to us about how environmental justice starts in the community, learnings from the Nature Neighbourhoods project. So Rory works for the National Trust on the Nature Neighbourhoods project, and this seeks to support and build the capacity of local initiatives to create happier, healthier and greener urban communities. So over to you, Rory. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Catriona, and thanks very much previous presentation as well. I will not be speaking nearly so poetically or beautifully, I'm afraid. So we're going from the sublime to the ridiculous here. I'm going to be talking in a very sort of non-poetic way. Let me just check that this is sharing properly. Catriona, can you give me a thumbs up that you can see my slides rather than my notes, etc.?
Yeah, we can just see the slides. That's
great. So yes, I'm Rory. I'm based up in Glasgow, working for the National Trust on the Nature Neighbourhoods project, which is a partnership with RSPB and WWF and 18 community organisations up and down the UK, funded by National Lottery Community Fund and Co-op. I think that's all the disclaimers and terms and conditions I need to give you at the start. I'm going to talk about this work, why environmental justice starts in the community, and why, if the environmental sector is sort of at all serious about ending the nature crisis, that it needs to shed some pretty seriously misanthropic baggage and become community-led. So, what does environmental injustice look like at the local scale? I think most people probably know this, and there's any number of examples that you could use from around the UK. But I'm going to use one from Birmingham because the City Council there has made this very useful environmental justice map, which is based around access to green space, flood risk, urban heat island, health inequalities, indices of multiple deprivation. So it's really recognising that connection and link between social and environmental justice. And I'm going to compare a sort of red ward and a deep green ward that you can see on this map. They're about 4 miles apart. And the left-hand picture is Nechells, which is the ward that's circled at the top. And you can immediately see a distinct lack of green space with the Google Maps image there. It's bordered by a motorway, so there's issues around air pollution. There's the associated impacts on health. Income poverty is a key factor. If we look at the right-hand image, which is Edgbaston, that's just about 4 miles away. Further south, it's the deep green one that you can see on the map there. And all the associated health, income, climate markers are all more positive. And you can see immediately from an overhead view that there's a lot more green space. And maybe it goes without saying, but this is injustice. You know, the fact of where you live determining your access to an environment that helps you and others in your community thrive. And the message here is really that we need to address environmental injustice at this level, at the neighbourhood level, where people live, and in a way that centres their needs. And I see this as our biggest environmental challenge in this country, actually, that we've been forcibly disconnected from nature. And if we want it looked after, we need it to be part of our lives again, and we need to do it where 80% of us live, which is in towns and cities. So the good news is that we did a project for 2 years and now it's all fixed. We can all go home, hooray. No, obviously not, but I think we've hopefully demonstrated something important to the environmental sector and supported some amazing community organisations in the process. So I've mentioned that we collaborated with 18 organisations in 18 neighbourhoods around the UK. Here's where they all are, from sort of Glasgow and Edinburgh in the north to Plymouth in the south. The focus was on underserved neighbourhoods, so that the type of wards that might show up red on an environmental justice map. And the organisations were quite a diverse mix of sizes and types of organisations. So some classically nature-focused, others community growing. We worked with a theatre and arts organisation that mainly works with refugees and asylum seekers, a community centre network, and so a big mix. And I've included here our 4 project outcomes. So the first was essentially to support those community organisations to co-design a neighbourhood plan for nature and climate action in their place with their communities. The second was to create a sort of meaningful training and capacity building programme with the community organisations, focused on the things that they needed for their organisations and their communities. Third was to build the power of community organisations to get some big local system actors, particularly local authorities, to remove some of the barriers to action for nature locally. And finally, we had an outcome around us as big environmental organisations learning to be better at working with communities, which is sort of a fundamental issue which I've pointed to earlier. And this is broadly how we went about doing it. So it's not on this slide, but first of all, each organisation participating got a sort of small grant of 25k. That came with very few strings, largely use it how you wish, and most used it for staff time flexibly. There was not heavy reporting requirements. The project was about creating time and space. And we established connections between the 18 organisations through monthly online meetings. We also had an in-person meeting to kick things off in Islington last year. We've had subsequent ones in other cities. We encouraged all the organisations, after we'd sort of established the cohort, to run a walk and talk in the neighbourhood that they were focusing on. And that was an opportunity to bring together key stakeholders, whether it was councillors or other community orgs or residents, to not only look at the existing assets and what that place needed, but also to think about what the organisations might need from the project and what skills and capability they wanted to build to work on those issues or to improve on those assets within those communities. So from there, the cohort identified the priority things they wanted to work on, and I've listed them all here. I won't read them out, but we went then on to build our programme of training and support around those priorities. And you'll notice that none of these are really about environmental things. They're about building and sustaining an organisation. That's what folk wanted from us as a sector, as an environmental sector, which is interesting. The last step in the chain here, we then did that stuff, as I sort of mentioned. The last step in the chain here is benefits at the community level. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but we never really set out to deliver anything in terms of actual nature in the course of this project, but I'll be damned if you can stop community organisations from delivering. So we saw some great stuff happen. And floating over on the sort of left-hand bottom corner, you can see that there's a sort of underlying support of a dedicated team. So not just to sort of oversee and manage the whole programme, but we had project officers in each country to provide more direct support to each of the community organisations and identify opportunities, troubleshoot. And we also had a digital comms officer to help tell the stories of the sort of diversity of people who are doing amazing things in their places. Now, as I mentioned, in amongst all that, all the organisations co-designed with their communities neighbourhood plans for nature and climate action, and these are some of the front covers. They're as diverse and interesting as the neighbourhoods themselves. So in terms of a sort of deliverable from the project, each of these plans is a sort of community-driven set of ideas to make their communities better for nature and climate. And what's the upshot of all this? You know, what's happened as a consequence? So I'm going to work my way backwards through the things I described there from the neighbourhood plans, which I just mentioned. I don't have time to go into all the detail, but I think it's really interesting to sort of do a bit of analysis around the overarching themes, which I've listed here. And the one that was in every single plan, all 18, has been around inclusion and access. So whether that's like a literal physical gathering space within a community, a building, within a green space itself, a shelter, or whether it's about getting around, you know, pathways, wayfinding, safer access points, or whether it's about activities and activation and seeing yourself or your part of the community represented in that space. A big theme around that. There was then something about partnerships, which you might expect, and listed there are some of the likely partners that folk wanted to connect with, and as a means of sort of expanding their work, recognising as a community organisation you might have limitations to how far your work can reach. Unsurprisingly, something about creating new wildlife habitats and, you know, particular interest in connecting them up through sort of green corridors. A big thing about enhancing existing green spaces, and not just with new features like wildflower meadows or hedges or whatever, but also things to do, reasons to be in the space, reasons to connect with one another. Big theme around food growing, and this comes up time and again as a real entry point for people into nature, and to do that in a community space, to do that somewhere where you can meet a neighbour and you can learn something new together. And a big emphasis also on building skills and confidence and, you know, planting seeds and nurturing something and growing something, and indeed then cooking something together and building that sense of community. Lots of stuff about play, whether that's creating new spaces or improving existing ones. A lot of the neighbourhoods we're focusing on don't have a lot of places for kids to play, but they've got a very young population. So that was a really critical theme and a real need to create more natural play spaces and just play spaces in general for kids to connect to nature in particular. A big theme around training and skills, not just to build community capacity and capability to sort of manage and steward spaces, but also for green jobs within the communities in the future. Tree planting, people love trees and people want to address tree equity, which can address some of the environmental factors around air pollution, etc., and the urban heat island effect. And then community ownership, both literal, like community owning assets and stewarding assets within the community, and a sense of ownership, you know, being able to see yourself in a place, in a green space, in a blue space, and feel that it's part of you and something that you are there to look after as well. So what worked from the project? So stepping back out away from the neighbourhood plans to the sort of wider support offer, I think, you know, we've got about 5 months of the project left, and a couple of weeks ago we had a big event and reflected on this with the cohort. I think having a community-led ethos from the beginning was really critical. You know, that was our kind of North Star for the project. That's what we were focused on, is being community-led, and we co-designed almost everything within the project with people. We had, you know, the funding, the 25k was flexible and it built capacity and it wasn't tied down to particular tasks or activity, and that helped a lot. We had bespoke support from our project officers, so being able to have someone on the ground helping, you know, sometimes literally a shoulder to cry on, other times, you know, somebody there practically to help troubleshoot or resolve an issue was really important. Creating a network of 18 organisations, so people would come together at our in-person meetings or online or of their own accord, and having that peer-to-peer support as community organisations really built solidarity, really built an understanding of collective issues and ways to solve them. We trained loads of people, which was great, so over 400, and that worked well. Did some great storytelling through the social media accounts, you know, RSPB and WWF particular, and platformed a lot of the stories that we created, the short films we made. There was local press, national press. We had a lot of noting from the organisations about improved and new relationships they had, especially with local authorities, who are the sort of real key and the real important factor for community organisations being able to do their work at a local level, but they don't have a lot of time and capacity regularly to go and advocate for things they want to do. And then also unlock funding, so practically through training, but also through unlocking new funding stream opportunities or supporting organisations to see themselves in a new light, you know, as consultants or through contract work as well. What didn't work or could have worked differently? Well, I don't think we achieved systems change. I mean, maybe that's a lofty aim to do within 2 years anyway. and strictly speaking, it's not part of our project outcomes, but I think we did achieve a sort of systems tweak or initial ripple in a number of local authority areas where we started to see people moving. We started to see council recognition of the work that community organisations were doing in a way that they didn't in the past. I think ideally we would have made this project longer. You know, it's very much a pilot within the environmental space to do community development essentially, but I think it would be good to do something of longer length. I think capacity is a constant challenge for the community sector. That's not surprising news, but you know, even with a grant to support people's time, not convinced that more money would have solved that problem because there are so many things that people have to deal with. This feels like a systemic issue for the community sector that needs to be addressed. I don't know. I don't think we've shifted environmental NGO culture. You know, I don't think we've gone all the way on us being community-led. I think there's a long way to go. We've definitely built capability within the 3 big NGO partners, but there is much work to do to become community-led and focused and confident in enabling and enhancing community work and not dictating to people what is required in their place. And it would be nice if we'd had a pot of implementation funding to go make all the stuff and the plans happen. We're going to support people to do that, find funding, but it would have been good to have a bit of our own. In terms of some tangible things, I said it's difficult to stop people from delivering, and my goodness, we definitely saw delivery in this project. So in the top left there, that's a brand new community, a co-designed community garden that's been put up on a derelict site in Main D in Newport in Wales. Beautiful space with a nice big mural next to a takeaway, a corner of a busy road. Top right here, this seems quite nerdy, but Grant and community gardeners who were part of the project up in Edinburgh, they used the money from the project to create time for them to go and lobby their local authority to change the procurement process. So now community organisations can apply to run housing association green spaces and look after them and manage them for the benefit of community and biodiversity, which is absolutely brilliant. Couple other things on that slide, but Catriona's about to tell me there's 2 minutes, so I'm just
yes, I'll go away
now. Now, hopefully the message you've taken from all this is that by enhancing the work of community organisations, big NGOs can do much more to tackle environmental justice than by trying to do it all by ourselves. And I think we need to see the community voice as central to us turning the climate and biodiversity crises around, because it's in our communities that we need to rebuild that lost nature connection I talked about at the start of this presentation. And the people best placed to do that are the organisations that are already out there and trusted in their places, not just creating green spaces, but, you know, running youth clubs, arts groups, sports clubs. And what we need to do as big NGOs is to act to enhance that and not try to deliver it ourselves. And most community organisations don't have an issue with delivery. They could deliver projects with their eyes closed. What they need is a supportive environment rather than a hamster wheel of short-term funding. So we need to build that community capacity through knowledge sharing, a support programme, more flexible funding for that type of development work. Then we need to work through community organisations to build a picture of what people's priorities are when it comes to nature and climate within their neighbourhoods. So using co-design processes, understanding what people want and need, listening to the voices least heard to ensure we're addressing local priorities and creating buy-in. And then from here, we need community organisations to be trusted by local authorities to be delivery partners to make those things happen, you know, via contracts, asset transfers, and getting access to the finance to do it, because they do it incredibly efficiently and incredibly well in a community-minded way. And you might be asking, what can we do to make all that happen? Well, one thing that's been good to see is that National Trust has ending unequal access to nature as one of its 3 central themes in its new strategy. And self-evidently, that's not something the National Trust can do on its own. Now, colleagues of mine working in the same bit of the organisation at National Trust have worked on the creation of this Nature Towns and Cities programme, which is a coalition of public, private and third sector bodies, which over the next 10 years is aiming to do a lot of things, but that includes 5 million more people with better access to green and blue spaces close to home, and 1 million more children able to play in nature on their doorstep. And while the initial focus of that programme has been on local government, we're in the process of using the learnings from nature neighbourhoods to inform a co-design process with communities for the community's bit of this work to really plug into that and hopefully move the dial on environmental injustice within our urban neighbourhoods. So watch this space. Yeah, that's all. Nothing else to say except other than environmental justice is clearly social justice, and I look forward to the conversations to come. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rory. That was brilliant. And I can see questions are coming in the Q&A. So I'd encourage people to keep on adding there, and I'll be gathering those up at the end. We are going to go over the noon cutoff by 5 minutes because we started late. So let's move on now to our third case study panel. So very pleased to introduce Jo Smith and Flavia Ojok from the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust, who are going to speak to the question of the following question, that in the age of polarisation, how can we remain firm in delivering anti-racist environmental action? So a couple of brief intros. So Flavia is the Deputy Director of Equity and Green Skills at the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust, where she leads strategic work to make the environmental sector more inclusive and accessible. And Jo is Chief Executive of Derbyshire Wildlife Trust, leading its bold Wilder 2030 strategy to restore nature across Derbyshire and beyond. So thank you so much for being here, and over to the two of you.
Thank you. Let me just get my screen shared. We just thought that we'd get started by just giving a little bit of a introduction to both Jo and myself, just a really quick one. So as already mentioned, I'm the current Deputy Director of Equity and Green Skills at Derbyshire Wildlife Trust. I've been at the Trust for 4 years, and in this role I focus on shaping a nature-rich transition that not only restores landscapes and wildlife, but also transforms lives, enabling all to recognise and benefit from the deep interconnection between people and the natural world. So in practice, this means that I often find myself collaborating with others in the act to dismantle systemic barriers and co-create a future grounded in shared rights and opportunities. So we do this through creating equitable pathways into green jobs, fostering co-beneficial community partnerships, and embedding justice within our organisational systems. This ensures that we make equity and nature recovery an inseparable one. So that leads me to introduce Jo. Jo, take the lead.
Hi everyone, lovely to be here. Yeah, as mentioned, I'm Chief Exec at Derbyshire Wildlife Trust and have been for several years now, and we've been working really hard to embed some real changes around inclusion and diversity into our organisation. And I'm also privileged to sit on the Landscape Advisory Board for Natural England, and have recently been on the board for the Heritage Fund, looking at their landscape and nature and access work. So have a kind of rounded input outside of just Derbyshire. Thank you.
Jo. So just to introduce sort of the focus of the 15-minute session that we wanted to bring across to this platform, we wanted to sort of bring a conversation around sort of how we deliver anti-racism work in the face of environmental injustice and environmental racism. And I think we couldn't do that work without actually sort of spotlighting or bringing into attention sort of the current climate that we're doing this work in. So we really are keen to have this discussion and welcome everyone into this discussion as well. As we know, and as it says there, environmental racism remains a pressing reality across the UK. As public debates grows, more polarised, opportunities for meaningful action diminish. And we don't want this to happen, so we want to sort of share some of our learnings and some of the things that we're doing in the face of this polarisation, but also what we've sort of entrenched and embedded throughout our organisation as well. We do this to create a hopeful space, so we don't want to necessarily sit in the polarisation. We want to actually create a space where we are open to others' perspectives, sort of hearing how people are making meaningful action in this space. And we want to be involved in meaningful conversations that do lead to real change. This is because we truly believe that this is a collective mission. It's not just a Derbyshire Wildlife Trust mission. We do find it imperative, but we always seek to bring everyone along in that journey. So to sort of aid in that a little bit, we thought we'd kind of explain sort of where our starting point is, and that's kind of how we do this work. So we actively acknowledge what our starting points are, where our why we find this work important, and we acknowledge the position of others as well. So to sort of help and open up that debate, we'd like to share sort of what our starting point was and is, and sort of how we're sort of moving forward with this work.
Thanks, Flavia. Flavia says we've been spending time as an organisation in that kind of uncomfortable space. So we've been trying to get comfortable with being uncomfortable and really thinking deeply about the important work of our journey towards a wilder Derbyshire and what that means and how we make it inclusive and how everyone feels part of that journey. And, you know, that hasn't been a sudden shift. That's been a very slow evolution of change over several years. And over the last 18 months, we've been refreshing our strategy, and we've just launched in June our new strategy, which is called Wilder 2030. And we made a real big decision as part of that process to really listen, to learn, to really think about the barriers and the systemic problems that we have in our society that are preventing us from having nature that is accessible to everyone. And as a result, our strategy, again, Wilder 2030, isn't just about species and landscapes. It's about reimagining who gets to be part of this recovery and who benefits from it. And in some ways, we've done some of the easy work already as part of our last strategy 5-year period. So several years ago, we created, as Flavia's already mentioned, paid year-long placements for non-graduates and people who've been excluded from the sector in the past to encourage pathways into work. We became a real living wage employer. And we built an agile hybrid way of working. So we work a 9-day fortnight, which means that people can be more flexible and we can be more inclusive. And then we've also worked hard to make recruitment, inclusion, engagement much more inclusive, much more accessible. And we've really tried to challenge what we think, how we think, and those kind of assumptions about who should be in the room and who is in the room. And we've also embedded, Rory spoke really eloquently about community organising. We've embedded community organising right across our organisation and done lots of training for our staff in that space so that we can run programmes right across Derbyshire. And we've invested in a team. I think that's been a really important, crucial part. So Flavia is amazing. I have to say that because she's here, but she is incredible. And she has a team now, and we've invested in that. So this becomes deeply rooted into the way that we work and the things that we do. And those changes really mattered because they created a real foundation of fairness and inclusion. And you know, we were really proud to be named as a top 100 employer because of the work that we've done to help everyone feel like they belong and that they're part of our organisation. But our new focus takes it much, much further. We want to be bold and we want to be transformative. So our new strategy is going much deeper. We're looking at how we shift power, how we share leadership, and how we really understand what anti-racism means for our culture, for our partnerships, for our decisions about land and nature and who we work with. And we're honest that we're still a long, long way away from where we want to be. We've made a commitment to do this, but it won't happen overnight. But we've chosen to move with intention, to move with consistency, to be accountable to those actions. And we've learned that how we move is actually more important than how fast or how far we go. So for us, we really want it to be about lived experience, about real progress rather than performative action. And so we're staying grounded, we're being authentic, we're working together, we're being collaborative because we genuinely believe that trust, consistency, authenticity are what will carry us through and what will enable us to build a Derbyshire that is for everybody. Over to you, Flavia.
Thank you, Jo. So to sort of give you a bit of a feeling of what this looks like in practice, so it's, I suppose, wrapped up and encapsulated in this sentence for us. So at Derbyshire Wildlife Trust, anti-racism in the face of environmental racism means addressing disproportionate environmental harm by ensuring fair access to nature, amplifying racialised, underrepresented and underserved voices, and actively dismantling systemic barriers in conservation. So in practice, this means that this work is in what we do, it is in how we act, and it is in how we are as an organisation. And that's because for Derbyshire Wildlife Trust, the challenge is to stay principled and proactive, showing that fairness, inclusion and equity are at the heart of credible environmental action, and it's not an optional add-on. However, we do acknowledge we're doing this work in a more polarised backdrop. So political discourses is becoming more divided, and in inclusion work, sometimes inclusion work is positioned as political or ideological. This can make organisations potentially more cautious about the language and also about visibility. However, for us, fairness and belonging are universal, and they're not just partisan positions where you choose a side. So in the next slide, we will show you exactly how we put that into practice and how we hold true to fairness, community and care. When it comes to polarisation, we often find that it sort of gives way to more reduced spaces for dialogue. It creeps up and it makes people honest conversations harder. It makes people a little bit less willing to have those tough, difficult conversations that Joe says that we're trying to have more of. So that to us means that we need to push forward, and it means that it's in what we do. So what that looks like in practice is that we're working really hard to shift what those spaces look like that these conversations are had, and what those decision-making spaces are also, and who is involved in those decision-making spaces. That's internally and externally. So internally, we have networks and we have spaces that we create, whether that's through lunch and learns, and we've got EDI networks where people do come together and we have these tough, difficult conversations. We've also started to implement tools across the organisation, such as our equality impact assessments, and those actually are there to evoke those sort of challenging conversations around programmes and our ways of delivering. They're built to challenge our thinking before we actually bring about policy change, programme design, any form of delivery. They're meant to platform a more open dialogue when it comes to some of the key tougher issues. Externally, through our projects, such as our Allistory Park Rewilding project, we model transparent public engagement. So communities are not just invited, but they're leading change, and they're leading what rewilding looks like. That means that they're shaping decisions, and we're not just in the receiving end of them, we're actually co-creating with them. Our aim is to make spaces like this voluntary. We're aiming to make them trauma-informed, and we're aiming to allow people to have space where they do say, I don't understand, and to do that without fear. We also tackle structural barriers through this. So we have some improvements to do in this, and some of the ways that we've done that is exactly like what Joe mentioned, is building the community organising all the way throughout our organisation. So that means that our methods and our ways of doing community work are becoming more community-led, less of us giving and telling and showing, and more of us listening and acting. What that means, like in practice, is that it's given way to more deeper rooted connections within our communities. Another structural barrier, which I'm sure that all of you do recognise, is around leadership and the lack of diversity in leadership spaces. That means that these spaces where our decisions are made tend to be more closed off. What we're seeking to do is sort of break that barrier, and that means that we're actually thinking about programmes and actions that we can actually do to actually shift what those spaces look like. So we're developing and are in the works of launching, and we have launched actually, but we're in the works of setting up our Lead Wilder governance programmes, which is designed to open up opportunities for individuals to step into governance. We're going to keep pushing. Systemic change isn't easy, but we're providing tools, we're reviewing every programme, and importantly, we're holding ourselves accountable in this space. Another key area of the impact of polarisation is that you often find that marginalised voices do get quieted. Is that our 2-minute warning?
2-minute warning, yes.
Amazing.
Thanks.
Marginalised voices do end up getting sidelined in this process. So we're doing our work to decenter ourselves as an organisation. What that looks like in practice, it means that we're promoting co-governance. We're bringing in voices from across the county and across cities and in individuals and in spaces that we don't probably have historically not accessed before. And we're ensuring that the nature decision making isn't just from ourselves. And finally, in the face of increased backlash and resistance, simply put, we're just going deeper. We're staying firm. We're holding true. However, we're not doing this in a space of resistance per se, but we're doing it in a space of more in an informed practice. So we're ensuring that our staff and everyone involved in our organisation feel equipped to actually deal with the challenges that comes with doing this work in a polarised space. in interest of time, we're going to talk through our challenges and learning in that. So I'll let Jo talk through some of our challenges.
Yeah, we were running out of time, and I think we've talked quite a lot about the challenge of this work and how complicated it is, and how it's really built on trust and authenticity. So making sure it's sort of deeply rooted across what we do. You know, the external environment's making it more complicated, but it also makes it more important. So we're really sticking with it. And I think for me, it's just that need to properly invest in this area if you're real about it. So back to you, Flavia.
Thanks, Jo. So just to finish off by saying our biggest learning is, like, we frame this work in around care, about fairness and about community action, and we are transparent in this work. And thirdly, we ensure that this work is not just about delivering for us, it's actually about sharing power, and that's because we know that together we can create a wilder Derbyshire where, when we say everyone belongs, we truly mean everyone belongs. I'll stop ourselves there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for keeping to time as well. Really appreciate that. So that's a really rich set of case studies we've got, and my mind is already sparking away with all the sort of ways in which they intersect and connect and speak to one another. But we have just under 10 minutes for Q&A, and there are a whole bunch of questions which have been posted in the Q&A box. So let me start by giving each of the groups one question each, and then we'll see how we're doing for time before moving into the breakout groups. So I'm going to start with a question for Sia, which relates to getting young people to engage with poetry. So the question is, how do you get young people who might not be experienced with poetry to engage with the Young Poets Network? Poetry can be forbidding to an outsider, and perhaps more so to young people from oppressed and excluded groups, ? How do you manage that? Thanks. So over to Sia to speak to that.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think really emphasizing the fact that the poetry that we're celebrating at Young Poets Network isn't necessarily the same poetry that people are studying at GCSE, that it's something that's theirs, that they can have fun with and use to express themselves. I'm sure lots of people feel the same way. Lots of young poets or like teenagers are writing poetry, but maybe not calling it by that name. So I know lots of us have written like song lyrics or sort of emo diary entries. We also do lots of, like Natasha mentioned, targeted schools projects. So really making sure that we're holding on to the young people who spark something through those and staying in touch with them through Young Poets Network. And to that second half about young people from oppressed and excluded groups, we really make an effort to make sure that the range of people who set challenges, like Anisha mentioned, she set one as a young poet. So we encourage lots of sort of peer-led activity, and we make sure that the young poets we invite to do that are diverse and from a range of sort of different groups. I think that representation really matters. Also, all of the workshops and challenges we run are completely free to enter, and we make sure that the workshops themselves are webinar style, so sort of like this, which means that if you're maybe a bit shy and you don't want to share your screen or like share yourself on video, you don't have to. You can just do it in your own home at your own pace. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Sia. And that's a really important point at the end, especially if you take sort of neurodiversity into account as well, and the challenges that brings to or can bring to engagement. Brilliant. Thank you, Sia. Moving on, question here. This is for Rory. Really interesting work. Please, could you speak more about the new or enhanced relationships between the communities and local authorities? I'm interested in knowing who in local government they are connecting with, planners, public health, environment officers, etc. And has there been engagement with elected stroke political members? Over to you, Rory, for that one.
Sure. And I think when you ask community organisations, like, how's your relationship with your local authority, it's like lighting the sparks in a room, because people are very exercised about it. And, you know, like most people, have some sort of frustration with their local authority. So yeah, it's a close but difficult relationship often, and it's only got more difficult post-austerity, right? Because community organisations are delivering a lot of the services that a local authority once delivered, and probably doing it on a fraction of the budget. and that, you know, that's difficult for local authorities too, right? They don't have the same amount of money. You've seen several going bankrupt, including Birmingham in recent years. That's, you know, that's a very challenging atmosphere to be in. And then there's like power dynamics that exist there, right, which I think are important, and probably a theme that's run through everything everyone said today, that need to be acknowledged and sort of dealt with it. And they often don't get said out loud, they don't get mentioned or talked about, and that creates a difficult situation. So at the start of the project, you know, it was clear it was sort of everyone's number one priority is to have a better relationship or to be doing things more effectively. So we, in the course of the project, work with Hope for the Future, who do a lot of work around advocacy on climate in particular. But we did a sort of two-tier program. There was one element which was like wider training for the community. So a lot of the folk that we trained were folk who worked with other community organisations or just residents within a community. We did some in-person training as well as online training about how local authorities set up, what they've got responsibility over, and how you can engage with them in a more meaningful way, including elected representatives. And that includes that sort of trying to see them as a 3D person, right? Trying to see them as somebody who you might not agree with everything on, but you might agree on some things, and it's worth meeting with them and building that relationship. And then also about the nuts and bolts of, like, you know, the council officers, the people who are sort of the civil servants at the council level doing the work that need to engage with. In terms of so that was a capacity building element, and the other element was a bespoke support element. So it was working with the individual organisations, with Hope for the Future, and saying, right, what are the things that you're struggling with? Have you got a particular issue or a politician that you want to pinpoint and work with, or have you got something you want to work on, and working through that with them? So whether it's getting a round table together and getting some of the key people around, or whether it's like, you know, a bit of an advocacy map and thinking about who's got influence and how to shape the influence there. These are services that big NGOs take for granted. We've got advocacy departments and teams, and we tend to work not at a local authority level, at a, you know, national government level, but there's not an advocacy function in most small organisations, and there's not even there is a collective voice sometimes, but a lot of organisations don't make the most of that NCVO or umbrella organisation type voice. So it was given that type of support to those organisations to enhance their voice and to give them the capacity and ability to engage in some of those difficult conversations without it feeling too personal. And then to answer the bit about who, parks departments, yes, but also health, people in the health sphere, neighbourhood managers. You know, we had really good feedback from the neighbourhood team at Manchester City Council, for example, for some of the work the community organisation was doing there. It's a mix of departments, depending on who's willing to engage, right? So many people talk about having that critical person in the council who's just willing to talk to you and engage with you. So a mix of folk.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rory. We have time now for one question to go to Flavia and Joe before we move on to the next bit of proceedings. So thanks, Flavia and Joe, for a great presentation. Really interested in hearing more about the impacts on how staff feel from people you engage with. Are other organisations coming to you for learnings, inspiration and advice? So we have a couple of minutes. Flavia and Joe, I'll hand over to either of you or both of you.
Well, yeah, probably both. I think I'll hand back quickly to Flavia, I think. But yes, I mean, it's mixed, as you always get in these spaces. So some of our staff are deeply into this and really driving it. Some staff, we're still supporting them on that journey of understanding. And then I think it's the same externally. We get lots of organisations wanting to learn from us and coming to us and asking us. And I think what we're struggling with a little bit, if we're honest, and Flavia might be able to expand very quickly, is just the difference between doing this in a superficial way and doing it in a really deep-rooted, authentic way. And I think sometimes that's hard to articulate.
Yeah,
Flavia.
and I think when that's crucial in the learning, I think. So we're always seeking to work with others in this space, and we're always seeking to learn from others and how they're doing delivery. So it works both ways. So people are sort of coming to us, but we're also actively seeking others who are doing it in a way that is deep and authentic, and are really looking to effect systemic change rather than, I suppose, like the quick wins, which sometimes work, but yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Sorry, Joe, did you want to come in again?
Not unless you to. No, thank you.
Okay, all right, wonderful. Thank you so much to all of you. I mean, the passion and the commitment and the enthusiasm that is just kind of bursting through here, I think, is incredibly inspirational and energizing. So really appreciate that from all of you today.